Hello, I'm Kristen. If you've seen any of my other video presentations, you may already be aware that I'm an avid native plant gardener. In addition to birding, it's one of my strong passions. My goal with this presentation, Gardening for the Future, is to illustrate why gardening has taken on a new role in our yards, from a hobby to a key part of conservation work. My other goals are to inspire you with which native plants to include in your garden and some ideas of different native plant gardening styles. Remember that the plants we put in the ground today will make a big impact on our wildlife in the future. So make informed decisions and have fun gardening for wildlife. Welcome to Gardening for the Future. I'm Kristen, and I'd love to connect with you. For all things native plant gardening, birding, and wildlife related, you can find me on Instagram using the handle @KristenMartin. Kristen with an E, Martin with a Y. And for all things backyard birds, connect with Wild Birds Unlimited Barrie or Wild Birds Unlimited Newmarket on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube using the handles @WBUBarrie and @WBU Newmarket. Here's a brief outline of the presentation. We're going to start with a couple of definitions, and then we'll move on to discuss the why, painting a picture of why we are dependent on our gardens, and a look at the new age of gardening, one where it's more than just the aesthetics. We will then move on to the how, covering gardening with native plants, sourcing plants, and discussing different gardening styles. And lastly, we'll finish up with resources and a wrap-up. I want to start off by giving a shout out to Dr. Doug Talmy, who's a personal hero of mine, and his team. A large portion of the information from this presentation comes from Dr. Talmy's research. Dr. Talmy is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. When I first began my journey in gardening with native plants, I took out Dr. Talmy's book, Bringing Nature Home, from the library. I was so inspired by his information about all the relationships between plants and animals, his research, and his method of presenting the subject matter in a way anyone can understand. I highly recommend, if you haven't done so already, read Dr. Talmy's books. They are so interesting and inspiring. You can also follow his Homegrown National Park initiative on the organization's website and social channels. I also highly recommend listening to him speak live. You can find some of his presentations online. He presents the information in such an energetic and entertaining way. Thank you, Dr. Doug and team, for all of the work that you do. So what is a native plant? Well, the broadest definition is any plant that historically grew in a particular area prior to colonization. They can also be described as plants that interact with the community that they historically helped. I really like the philosophy that Dr. Doug Talmy presents regarding native plants. He argues that as gardeners, we don't need to be purists in the use of native plants. In other words, we don't need to only incorporate plants into our gardens that are found within a short distance of our homes. It's more important to recreate the functioning habitat for wildlife. We need to consider choosing plants to fill an ecological role that will support the habitat around our homes and the local wildlife. In other words, let's say a plant is native just south of the Great Lakes and historically didn't occur in Ontario. It still may hold value to the wildlife here in Ontario. Many species that are found in Ontario will have co-evolved with it a little further south. For example, birds may still eat the fruit or seeds as they pass by the plants during migration. Butterflies and moth species may still use it as a houseplant, and bees may still be specialists at pollinating its flowers. A plant which historically grew near your home may also be difficult to find or have scattered populations throughout the province, especially if you reside in an area that is now heavily developed. All that being said, I visited a native plant garden in Ontario that was created only using plants found in a 100-kilometer radius of the property. The garden was stunning. So really, it comes down to the vision that you have for your yard. Another important term to discuss is the word weed. Many of us like to think of weeds as plants in a place where we don't want them to be. I personally like to think of weeds more specifically as an invasive species, introduced into the environment purposefully or inadvertently by humans. For example, dog strangling vine. It's also important to note that so many of our native plants get bad publicity from having a common name with the word weed in it. Milkweed, jewelweed, ironweed are just some examples of this. Doesn't really sound very appealing to include a plant with the word weed in its name in your garden, does it? Perhaps we should consider renaming them for better marketing and acceptance. Let's take, for example, spotted jewelweed, a plant I love. It's got beautiful flowers, which hummingbirds and bees adore, fun seed pods, which pop and explode, and as an added bonus, it provides soothing relief to poison ivy and stinging nettle rashes, as well as insect bites and stings. If we renamed it Dazzling Jewel, wouldn't that be an even more compelling reason to include it in your garden? Just saying. The local ecosystem is full of connections and relationships between plants and animals. A great example of this is blue jays and acorns. Blue jays love to eat acorns. Each fall, a single blue jay is responsible for hiding or caching hundreds, if not thousands, of acorns. The benefit to the oak tree is that the blue jay will inevitably forget where it hid some of these acorns, and the ones a squirrel doesn't sniff out will develop into an oak tree. In fact, blue jays are responsible for planting the majority of oak trees since the last ice age in eastern North America. It's also important to note that oak trees are a keystone species, a species that supports a wide variety of wildlife. So the relationship between blue jays and oak trees is an important one, not only to the jays, but to hundreds of other species that rely on oaks. This is only one example in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of relationships that occur each and every day around your yard. Here's one more example of the connections between plants and animals that's probably happening around your home, or close by at the very least. Goldenrods are another keystone species supporting lots of different wildlife. One such critter is the goldenrod gallfly. A female gallfly will lay her eggs at the tip of an emerging goldenrod stem. Once the larva hatches, it chews into the stem and produces a gall which provides the larva with both food and protection. Come the fall, the gallfly larva produces its own type of antifreeze and settles in for a long winter in its cozy gall. The gallfly will emerge as an adult in the late spring, but it will only emerge if a hungry predator, like a black-capped chickadee, doesn't find it first. Chickadees, woodpeckers, and other birds can peck a hole in the side of the gall and extract the larva for a snack. Yum. You can tell which flies successfully escaped and which ones were eaten. Gulls that are predated will have large holes with rough edges where the birds pecked into the gall. In contrast, when a gallfly emerges, the only trace it leaves behind besides the gall itself is a small, neat, and tidy escape hole. Isn't the nature in your yard fascinating? It's discouraging to read the news sometimes when it comes to the loss of wildlife and biodiversity on our planet. As with this headline from the Washington Post, 1 million species face extinction, UN report says, and humans will suffer as a result. Or this one from the New York Times. The insect apocalypse is here? What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? And who can forget the 2019 study published in Science magazine describing the loss of almost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970? The one-sentence summary reads, cumulative loss of nearly 3 billion birds since 1970 across most North American biomes signals a pervasive and ongoing avifaunal crisis. This is scary stuff. While sometimes we like to think we're the exception, Just like the birds, we humans are dependent on ecosystem services from both plants and animals for our survival. Plants and animals provide a host of essential services. Plants produce oxygen, clean water and slow down its journey to salt water, capture carbon and put it in the ground, build topsoil and hold it in place, prevent flooding, dampen severe weather, and of course, convert sunlight to food. Animals provide a host of services as well, providing pest control, pollination of nearly 90% of flowering plants, and dispersing plant seeds. Digging deeper into the services of animals, we find that humans, along with the rest of the planet, are really indebted to insects, or as E.O. Wilson calls them, the little things that run the world. Without insects, most flowering plants would go extinct, which would result in a change to the physical structure and energy flow of most terrestrial habitats. This would cause a rapid collapse of food webs that support other life, such as amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The biosphere would rot due to the loss of insect decomposers, and humanity would essentially be doomed. To quote E.O. Wilson once more, "The truth is that we need invertebrates, but they don't need us. If human beings were to disappear tomorrow, the world would go on with little change." We need biodiversity for our survival on this planet. Yet maintaining this biodiversity seems to be more challenging with each passing year. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at some of the factors impacting birds and other wildlife here in Ontario. First, consider that Southern Ontario is home to 13 million people, or 35% of Canada's total population. And in this area, 72% of the land is privately owned. That number does not take into account land owned by governments or things like roadways, and we certainly have a lot of roads crisscrossing the southern part of our province. One of the major challenges to wildlife is habitat loss, especially when you consider just how much land is developed in Southern Ontario, and that the development just keeps sprawling. So where does this loss of habitat leave our wildlife? Habitat loss results in many things, including road mortality, window collisions, the decrease of historical predators and the introduction of non-native predators, increasing use of pesticides and fertilizers, and the introduction and spread of invasive species. I should clarify that this list is not unique to Ontario. These factors contribute to wildlife decline around the globe. But declining wildlife and biodiversity is not a NIMBY, not in my backyard problem. These issues facing our wildlife are happening every day in each of our backyards. Okay, so I just laid it on pretty thick and have described some pretty heavy stuff here. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. The good news is that we can save our insects, birds, other wildlife, nature, and ourselves. But we have to change the way we landscape and think about landscaping to do it. And that's where we're going to turn our attention for the remainder of the presentation. Dr. Talmay talks about how past conservation work has focused on where people weren't, like parks and protected areas. And we now need to save nature where people are. For the most part, people are in cities and towns. We spend a lot of time at home, and perhaps here in Ontario at the cottage. Whether you live in a high-rise building or out in the country, conservation needs to start at home in your outdoor space. Our gardening focus really needs to change from one that's primarily aesthetics-based to one that is conservation and habitat creation driven. As we know, many species are in rapid decline. However, the good news is that we have a lot of information at our fingertips, including firsthand experiences. For example, we've seen the introduction of non-native species and know how to learn from these mistakes. There's also more availability of native plants, native plant landscapers, seed exchanges, native plant sales, and incentive programs. Gardening is now a collaborative effort of a community. Never before has your yard and what you plant in it mattered as much as it does right now. We're also empowered as gardeners and consumers. We have the decision-making power to alter the gardening, nursery, and landscaping industries by choosing to purchase native plants and choosing not to purchase plants that are potentially invasive, such as lily of the valley, periwinkle, and Norway maple. Native plants truly are the backbone to healthy habitats. Specifically, healthy habitats are made up of a diverse offering of native plants. Birds and other wildlife have specialized relationships with native plants, and they can't simply change because the plants are not as abundant as they once were. These relationships took thousands of years to form and co-evolve. If the plants are not available, this will unfortunately result in the decline, extirpation, or extinction of a species. One of the most widely known examples here in North America is the relationship between the monarch butterfly and milkweed, the plant that their caterpillars exclusively feed on. The decline of monarchs has been linked in part to the decline of their host plant. These specialized relationships mean that we have to design our gardens to replicate healthy habitats, to attract and support birds and wildlife. We can't just cross our fingers and hope that they will conform to the non-native plants in our garden, because that simply won't happen. All parts of the ecosystem and nature are important. For example, this lovely eastern hognose snake, which is listed as threatened here in Ontario, is an important part of the local ecosystem. In fact, all snakes are. However, as Dr. Talmy points out, right now is the time to focus specifically on some of the most important species, or those species that contribute the most to ecosystem function. One of the groups of animals that heavily contributes to ecosystem function and that needs our help at the moment are the pollinators, the bees, wasps, and flies. Why are they so essential? Well, humans and many other organisms just can't survive without flowering plants, and we need these insects to sustain flowering plants, trees, and shrubs. Native bees are extremely efficient pollinators, even more so than the domesticated honeybees. 87% of plants pollinated by animals in North America are pollinated by 4,000 species of native bees. They also pollinate about a third of our crops. The other group of animals that plays a critical role in the function of an ecosystem is the larvae of butterflies and moths, the caterpillars. Caterpillars support food webs, and we need a lot of them to support our ecosystems. Most animals don't eat plants themselves. Many plants are toxic and do a really good job at discouraging animals from eating them. Other animals in our ecosystem rely on insects like caterpillars to eat toxic plants and turn them into energy or food. This transfer of energy occurs when a caterpillar is eaten by another animal, such as a bird. Birds rely very heavily on caterpillars. Consider that 96% of terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on caterpillars. That's incredible. To illustrate this point, let's look at a common backyard bird found in eastern North America, the black-capped chickadee. These birds are well studied and heavily rely on caterpillars to raise their young. So how many caterpillars do they need exactly? Dr. Talmy and his team estimates it takes between 14,000 to 22,000 caterpillars for a single pair of chickadees to successfully raise one brood. Let's break this down a little further. Dr. Talmy and his team determined chickadees can deliver food once every 3 minutes to their nest, and they forage during daylight hours, approximately 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. during the nesting period. In fact, his team watched a pair of chickadees deliver 30 caterpillars in 27 minutes. Dr. Talmy estimates they deliver between 390 to 570 caterpillars per day to their nest. Hatchlings are in the nest for just over 2 weeks, up to 18 days. Once they fledge and leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them for another 21 days. And so, after 40 days, the total time period required to raise a brood of chickadees to independence, in the end, the parents will have fed them between 14,000 to 22,000 caterpillars. That is a lot of caterpillars. The chart on this slide details 20 different bird families and what they feed their young. I'll call your attention to the green bar, which illustrates how many caterpillars are fed to baby birds as a percentage of their diet. We can see that in cardinals, for example, 54% of the diet of a fledgling is caterpillars. For cuckoos, this number is 60%, warblers 53%, vireos 67%, chickadees 75%, and so on. So why do birds like caterpillars so much? Well, for one thing, they're soft, so they're easy to fit in the mouth of a hungry baby bird. If you've ever watched a parent bird feeding its young, it's not a delicate process. Softer insects can be stuffed into their mouths and easily swallowed. Caterpillars are also large in size and nutritious, providing baby birds with a filling, healthy meal. Their large size also means that parent birds have to spend less time foraging. One giant caterpillar is much more efficient for a parent bird to gather than 100 small aphids. Caterpillars also have a low percentage of chitin in their body. That's the hard material that makes up an insect's exoskeleton. Think of the elytra on a beetle. It's much easier for a baby bird to eat something soft and squishy than something that has a lot of chitin with potentially sharp and pointy edges. Lastly, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids. Why do birds need carotenoids? There are 6 types of carotenoids, and all of them are made by plants. In birds and other wildlife, carotenoids improve sexual attractiveness. For example, in birds, this is represented by an enhancement of plumage color. They also improve sperm vitality, color vision, stimulate the immune system, and provide antioxidants that protect proteins and DNA from oxidative damage. Caterpillars have more carotenoids than any other invertebrate group. That's because they are eating the green leaves of plants. Caterpillars contain approximately 81 to 85% carotenoids. Compare that to adult butterflies, which have only 18%. It's much more beneficial to eat the larva. Given how much birds rely on insects like caterpillars, it's no surprise that when we take away insects, we lose birds. Here's a photo of a brood of chickadees that was raised in my yard. 2 parents raised 7 chicks. It was a big family. If you want to have chickadees nesting in your yard, as I do, and I hope you do because it's really fun to watch them, then you have to provide all of the caterpillars that they need in your yard. And when you take into account that chickadees only forage 50 meters from their nest, that means that your yard has to provide upwards of 22,000 caterpillars directly around their nesting site. If we landscape in a way that doesn't support all of those caterpillars, we experience insect decline. Studies have shown that insect decline is one of the major reasons that birds are declining across North America. Bird species that eat and rely on insects have declined on average 10 million individuals per species. All this to say, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I hope that I've illustrated that to garden for the future, we have to design landscapes for bees and caterpillars. How do we do that? By gardening with native plants. How much of a garden should be native plants? The answer is that gardens can include up to 30% non-native plants, but that should not include invasive species. Any more than 30% and gardens begin to become unproductive for wildlife. I'm going to sidestep for a moment to discuss invasive plants on a couple slides, because a major component of gardening for bees and caterpillars is controlling and removing invasive plants. We need to restore areas to usable habitat for these species, and invasive plants makes this very difficult and sometimes impossible. First, let's discuss what an invasive plant is. Essentially, it's a plant that's not native to an area and was not here prior to colonization. In terms of North American gardens, many of our garden variety plants originated in Europe or Asia, as we share similar climates. So typically, our invasive plant species originate from these areas. I speak a lot about native plant and wildlife gardening. Invasive species management is commonly a part of these types of conversations. After hearing me speak about invasive plants like lily of the valley or periwinkle, plants that many gardeners have been fond of for a long time. A common question I get from folks is, why can't I plant periwinkle in my garden? It behaves fine at my house. The answer to this question is multifold. We have to remember that our gardens only belong to us for a time, but the plants in our gardens may continue to impact the local ecosystem long after they are planted. Many invasive species are fast at spreading and can be difficult to get rid of. If they escape your garden, they can spread into the natural landscape and can be downright problematic for the local ecosystem. It's very easy for accidents to happen and for the plants in your garden to spread into the natural landscape. Seeds can disperse and begin growing. For example, I inherited a smoke tree, and I'm constantly finding seedlings that have popped up. You may divide and share your plants with someone, not knowing that a tiny piece of goutweed is mixed in with the root ball. And unfortunately, it's far too common for people to dump their yard waste in natural areas. If a piece of lily of the valley was in the yard waste, it's now been unleashed wherever it was dumped. The thing is, we know better now. We know that plants from our gardens can spread where they shouldn't, and we have a pretty good idea of what plants cause the most potential problems. Perhaps 70 years ago, people didn't have the knowledge about their garden plants that we have now, so we can't plead ignorance to the problems invasive species are causing. Have you ever wondered about how your neighbor feels about your plant choices? I can tell you I've seen some very unhappy people on native plant groups complaining about how their neighbors' gardens are taking over their yard. My first home had a teeny tiny backyard, which I filled with native plants. One day, to my surprise, a new plant popped up in my garden, and at first I didn't recognize it. After a few weeks, I realized my neighbor's patch of lily of the valley was invading our yard from under a fence. And I had to put in significant effort going forward to removing it each and every year. It was so frustrating that my neighbor's poor landscaping choices became my problem. There are species that are restricted for sale in Ontario. However, the list is small and not very comprehensive. Unfortunately, the gardening industry has to regulate itself much of the time when it comes to what plants are grown and sold. And if plants like goutweed are still being purchased and bringing revenue in, the odds of this changing are slim. As gardeners, we have to go the extra step and do our research on what we're putting in our gardens. And choosing where to put our money is going to make a really big difference into what plants are being sold. I regularly see a variety of what I and many others would consider invasive plants for sale at gardening centers, including periwinkle, lily of the valley, Japanese barberry, goutweed, also called bishop's goutweed, forget-me-nots, Norway maple, daylilies, and butterfly bush. Yes, butterfly bush. Believe it or not, butterfly bush is already becoming an invasive species in some parts of North America. I think of butterfly bush as fast food for butterflies. They get a quick nectar reward, however, there's no benefit to their caterpillars or habitat provided by this plant. So ditch the butterfly bush and plant something like meadow blazing star or a variety of milkweed instead. We really are responsible for what we plant in our gardens and how it can potentially affect the ecosystem afterwards. Here's an example of what an invasive species looks like. This is lily of the valley spreading like wildfire at a conservation area. We'll never know how it got there, but one thing's for sure, it didn't grow legs and walk here by itself. It was brought here by humans, either intentionally or by accident. Not all non-native garden plants pose the same risk to the local ecosystem. It's very unlikely, for example, that a hosta would go rogue and wreak havoc like lily of the valley. Even if a hosta did escape, it would be easy enough to pull it out and not have to worry about it reseeding. It's each of our responsibility to do our research and plant appropriately. Does it really matter which native plants you choose to include in your garden? The answer to that question is absolutely. 5% of native plants make up 75% of caterpillar food. In other words, 90% of caterpillar diversity is focused on 14% of plants. So it's important to focus on what we call keystone species, those species that best support biodiversity. With respect to woody plants, Dr. Doug Talmy and his team came up with a list of how many butterfly and moth species are supported by our native trees and shrubs. Here are the top 5. Oaks come in at number 1. They are the heavy hitters, supporting more species of butterflies and moths than any other tree genus, with a whopping 534 species supported. In second and third place, we have willows, the Salix genus, and cherry and plum, the Prunus genus, with a tie of 456 species. Not too shabby. In fourth and fifth place, we have the birch and the poplar and cottonwood, each representing trees that support 368 species of butterflies and moths. Remember that this is only the top 5, and there's many more native tree and shrub species that support butterflies and moths. Pines, for example, are another important keystone species. These numbers probably have a greater impact and take on more meaning when we compare them with how many species of butterflies and moths are supported by non-native ornamental trees from Asia, such as ginkgo. On average, non-native ornamentals support 0 to 3 species, a minuscule fraction of the support our top natives provide. And yet, in garden centers and gardens throughout North America, we see these non-native ornamentals everywhere. They are beautiful to look at, maybe, but effectively they are ecological dead zones. Just like trees, there are also flowering plants that are keystone species. Goldenrods, native asters, and native sunflowers, the coreopsis plants, are all keystone species. Milkweeds also support a number of butterflies, moths, flies, bees, and other insect species. When creating a garden, it's also important to include the keystone species of flowering plants as well. It's also important to have a continuous supply of blooms during all seasons. When planning your plantings, make a bloom chart to plan for continuous blooms, starting with the early spring and running through the late fall. Also consider which plants will provide cover during the winter months. Solitary bees and other insects rely on pithy plant stems, grasses, and other plants to provide shelter during the winter months as they hibernate. In addition to the use of keystone species, we also need to consider planting for specialist insects. Approximately 75% of the bees in our gardens are generalists, happy to feed and use a variety of native plant species. However, 25% are specialists, relying on only a handful of native plant species and sometimes just a single species. Some caterpillars are also specialists as well and are only able to use 1 or 2 plants as a host plant. To accommodate specialist pollinators and caterpillars, do some research as to what species may be found in your area. Plants including native willows, dogwoods, holly, blueberry, asters, heuchera, primrose, and milkweed are just some of the plants utilized by specialist pollinators. However, some specialists are so specific that only a handful of plants, and sometimes just a single plant species, is required. So doing some research and speaking to native plant experts in your area can really help to steer you in the right direction. I've hopefully convinced you it's time to plant some native plants in your garden. So where can you source these plants from? Really, anywhere you buy plants. Most nurseries include some native plants in their offerings. And you may be able to find plants grown by a local native plant wholesale nursery at traditional garden centers. However, my recommendation is that you seek out a specialist native plant nursery local to your area. A quick internet search should help to direct you to some native plant nurseries nearby. I love the shopping experience at local native plant nurseries and recommend you shop at one for a variety of reasons. First, you'll support the local people and families behind the business. There's nothing better than shopping local and supporting your community. Second, they can tell you a lot about the plants. Not only can they tell you the source of the seeds or the plants themselves, they should also be able to confirm that they've been grown without pesticides or fertilizers. And most importantly, they're happy to make recommendations specific to your garden conditions. If you come armed with information such as your soil type, pH, sun exposure, moisture levels, they'll be able to recommend which plants would do the best in your yard. I've also always found the prices to be very fair at native plant nurseries. And quite often, you'll find a sale partway through or at the end of season that you can take advantage of. Finally, they're just lovely to visit. They are often set in beautiful locations surrounded by beautiful gardens, forests, and ponds. You'll often hear birds singing and see butterflies and bees zooming around the plants. I've even taken a caterpillar or two home on the host plant I was purchasing. All in all, a wonderful shopping experience. While my favorite way to purchase native plants is by visiting the nurseries themselves, this isn't always possible. And there are now new nurseries popping up with different business models. So I wanted to share with you 3 ways I've purchased native plants outside of visiting a nursery. These 3 orders I received represent 3 different orders placed at 3 different nurseries. The first order shown on the left is courtesy of a nursery I visited before, but it's not really set up for visitors to walk around and browse. You have to pre-order and then visit to collect your plants from a designated spot. You can't just wander through and look. So instead of visiting them in person, I decided to try having the plants delivered by the nursery, and it was a great experience. The plants I ordered showed up quickly at my door, healthy and ready for the garden. And best of all, I didn't have to drive an hour and a half to pick them up. The second order shown in the middle is from an online-only native plant nursery. While they have a physical location where they keep the plants, customers cannot visit. Instead, the plants are shipped out to you in the mail. I've ordered a few times from this nursery, and it's a great service. The plants arrive in large boxes labeled live plants. Sometimes they get a little jostled while in transit, and the odd one ends up out of the pot, but you can just pop it back in. It's a very convenient way to shop. Lastly, the order on the right was one I purchased at my grocery store, believe it or not. Isn't that cool? My local grocery store was selling plants grown by local Ontario native plant nurseries, making them more accessible to a wider variety of people. The grocery chain has partnered up with at least 2 Ontario native plant wholesale nurseries, along with a not-for-profit organization to sell these beautiful plants at locations throughout Ontario and promote habitat creation. So you can pick up your groceries and a few goodies for the garden. How amazing is that? Now that you have an idea of where to purchase plants, let's talk about native plant garden design. I've seen enough native plant gardens to confidently say that you don't need to sacrifice your personal style to benefit wildlife. There are native plants that complement any garden aesthetic and space. You can create a successful native plant garden in any size space, whether you have a balcony or a larger lot. And don't forget about industrial spaces. There is habitat potential everywhere. I often hear about creating pollinator gardens. It's my personal belief that all gardens should be pollinator gardens, and butterfly gardens, and bird gardens, and spaces for wildlife. No matter what your style preference, you can create a native plant garden to suit your space, including formal gardens, modern or contemporary gardens, traditional gardens, cottage gardens, container gardens, rain gardens, ferneries, rock gardens or xeriscaping, shade and woodland gardens, meadow prairie gardens, and vegetable gardens. While I don't have time to go through examples of all these styles as native plant gardens, in the next few slides, I'll review some examples of different native plant garden styles. Container gardens. Here's a container garden I created, and I like to call it an alvar in a pot. I've tried to recreate a miniature version of Ontario's alvar habitat with crushed limestone and 3 species of plants: red anemone, lakeside daisy, and dwarf Canadian primrose. All purchased from local native plant nurseries, by the way. This photo was taken right after I planted it, and the plants have now filled out really nicely. Container gardens don't have to be as specialized as this, but I wanted to demonstrate that there are endless possibilities. For container gardens, you want to try and include 3 elements: the taller thriller plants that give you height, the spiller plants that dangle outside of the container, and the filler plants that bulk up the middle. This is not a comprehensive list, but I've made a couple suggestions on the slide of plants you could include in a container garden depending on your lighting conditions. I also want to mention that sometimes using a single plant over and over again in a container can really make a statement. I've never understood why Boston ferns are so popular among people who want a clean and contemporary look when we have so many amazing native ferns to choose from. We've made a planter at our house that features all ostrich ferns. It makes a really great impact in a shady location. And best of all, they're winter hardy and return every single year, unlike Boston fern. Formal gardens. This photo isn't a great example of the type of formal garden I'm referring to. This is one of my native plant gardens, and while I don't consider it formal per se, it does have a very formal border, which separates the garden from a patch of thin lawn. In the next slide, I'm going to show you an example of a very formal contemporary garden. This video was made by Dr. Doug Talmey's Homegrown National Park team and features a very formal native plant garden made by Lynn O'Shaughnessy of Michigan. Her garden is the perfect example that you can make a native plant garden as formal as you wish. When I think of formal gardens, I think of clean lines and plants that play nicely. They stay in neat clumps and behave properly. So here's a list I came up with of some native plants I believe would fit what you're looking for in a formal garden. That being said, a large component of formal gardens is design. As the previous video well demonstrated, you can use almost any plant in a formal garden because you can create a design to fit the plants. Rock gardens. More and more, we are experiencing drought conditions across North America, and sometimes for extended periods of time. Some communities have put limits on watering gardens to conserve water where necessary. Rock gardens or xeriscaping features plants that look great no matter how little rain the garden receives. And did you know there are species of cacti that are cold hardy and native to Ontario and other parts of Canada? It's true. This slide features a Canadian species, the Plains prickly pear cactus. I have very fond memories of exploring my grandmother's beautiful rock garden, which is probably why I have such a soft spot for this gardening style. Species that are drought tolerant, such as hardy cacti, stone crops, and alpine species, can be included in rock gardens. Just be sure to place your rock garden appropriately. Cacti shouldn't be planted in areas that are high traffic or where pets and children can access them. Vegetable gardens. This portion of the presentation was inspired by Janice Keel's Rewilding the Vegetable Garden presentation. Janice advocates using native plants in and around vegetable gardens to increase the 3 Ps: pollination, predation, and parasitism. Including native plants in a vegetable garden will encourage a more diverse offering of pollinators, which will in turn result in a greater pollination of your veggies. Not only do we want to encourage native bees, but another powerful group of pollinators, flies, and specifically flower flies. Flower flies are pollinating machines, just like bees, and they even look like bees. The adults feed on pollen, and the larvae of flower flies eat aphids, so they provide a dual purpose in the garden. I can't fit all the important information from Janice's talk into this slide, but here are a few other points to note. You should also try to encourage native beetles, which are excellent predators, and parasitic wasps to the garden for natural pest control. To encourage beetles, create a beetle bank with dense native grasses near your vegetable garden. This will provide the young beetles and the adults with habitat and a sheltered place to overwinter. To encourage and attract more flies and wasps to your garden, Janice suggests planting a number of different natives, including early goldenrod. Remember how we talked about goldenrods as a keystone species? Golden Alexanders, cow parsnips, narrowleaf mountain mint, and Canada goldenrod. Just a quick note about Canada goldenrod. It is a species that can spread aggressively, so I thought perhaps it might be best to restrict its growth by planting it in a pot and then placing it in the vegetable garden. You can also use native plants as a trap crop. For example, by planting giant blue hyssop, you can lure pests like cabbage moths away from your brassica plants, including broccoli, kale, cauliflower, and Brussels sprouts. In the next portion of the presentation, we're going to look at the potential of native plants to transform unproductive spaces into habitat, because there is really no shortage of space for native plant gardens. Just think of how many potentially unproductive spaces can be transformed into vital habitat for wildlife. I've created a list of some areas that could replace pieces of lawn, concrete, or where container gardens could be placed. I'm sure you could think of many more places to add to this list. There's just so much untapped potential for habitat creation. If you don't believe me, just have a look at this photo. Believe it or not, this is a parking lot. Imagine if every parking lot median looked like this. This parking lot is full of native plants, including Joe Pyeweed, coneflower, cardinal flower, and pearly everlasting, to feed and provide habitat for wildlife. It's a great use of unproductive space. Here's another example of habitat creation. This is my local Tim Hortons. It's relatively new and features elaborate gardens around the drive-thru and building. The gardens feature a variety of native plants, including dogwoods, oaks, cedar, and grasses like little bluestem. The garden is filling in nicely, and it's really awesome to see that even a fast food restaurant can turn an unproductive space into some great habitat. I think the owners of the Tim Hortons on the previous slide also own this location as well, which is also close to our home. While the garden isn't completely made up of native plants, and there's room for improvement, I'm impressed that again, in their drive-through space, they've included serviceberry, coneflowers, native grasses, and there's even some rogue milkweed in there. This is the type of potential I'm talking about. Imagine if every drive-through you went to featured a garden with native plants. That's a lot of habitat. Here are a couple of other suggestions from Dr. Talmy on what we can do in our yards specifically to support caterpillars. While native trees are really important for a wide variety of pollinators, it's not helpful if the native trees have hard-packed lawn or soil below them. Remember that there are many species of caterpillars that once they pupate will drop down to the ground below and bury into the soil to remain safe until they're ready to emerge as adults. Having lawn beneath a tree or hard-packed soil makes it really difficult and sometimes impossible for caterpillars to pupate below the soil. So create caterpillar pupation sites under trees by maintaining loose soil or mulch or leaf litter around the base of your trees. When creating new native plant gardens or planting trees at our house, we use layers of mulch and leaf litter to suppress weeds until the garden matures, as well as to provide shelter for caterpillars and many other invertebrates. Leaf litter raked into the garden or left in place after falling from a tree provide an essential layer of shelter for small animals in our garden. And the birds love digging around in the leaves looking for bugs. It's time to rethink our fondness for lawn. Lawn is the second most unproductive place in our ecosystem. And to what, you might ask? It's second only to pavement. So if you're mowing grass, you have some room for improvement. You can change a liability in your yard into an asset by replacing lawn with native plantings. Where does our obsession with lawns come from? Well, historically, humans felt compelled to maintain low and open vegetation around their living quarters so we could better spot approaching predators. This is not so much of an issue anymore. Plus, lawns are filled mostly with exotic grasses, in some cases chemicals, and use up an unfathomable amount of water every year. Not to mention the machines and fossil fuels used for their maintenance. At our house, we've committed to reducing our lawn and remove a little bit more of it every year. I can tell you that our pollinators and other wildlife are already thanking us for the native plant gardens and restoration plantings we've installed. Dr. Doug Talmy challenges us all to cut our lawns in half with native plantings, and I think this is an attainable and reasonable goal to set. If we each replaced 50% of our lawn, think of the savings in fossil fuels, water, and chemical runoff. Not to mention all of the benefits to our wildlife. So take the pledge and ditch the lawn. Here's a photo of the garden we created in the previous slide 1 year later. Incredible how fast the plants have filled out, and it'll be amazing to watch this garden continue to transform over time. Now this is a no-brainer. But to help pollinators, do not spray pesticides or fertilize your plants. Here's a photo I took of one of my eastern redbud trees. And as you can see, the leaves look like Swiss cheese. They have holes all over them. If I didn't know any better, I might try to resolve this issue by spraying a pesticide on the leaves to keep whatever made these holes off. But I happen to know that these holes have a very distinct pattern, and they were made by leaf cutter bees, which wrap their eggs up with a pollen ball in layers of leaves. And redbud just happens to be one of the trees they really like to use to make their leafy cocoons. Insects in your garden are a good thing. You don't want a sterile garden. You want life in there. If insects are eating your plants, that's a good thing. That means you've provided them with the food source that they need for their survival. This is going to benefit your garden and your wildlife. And don't worry, nature will work itself out and those pests will be taken care of. And your birds are going to thank you for giving them lots of food for their babies. To avoid disturbing nocturnal wildlife, avoid keeping lights on at night. Songbirds, moths, bats, and other wildlife rely on dark skies for their migration, finding mates, hunting, etc. Using motion-sensitive lighting can provide the safety lighting that you require while considering the needs of wildlife. One group of pollinators outdoor lighting particularly affects are the moths. We don't really know why they are attracted to artificial lights. However, it is highly disruptive to them. As the saying goes, like a moth to a light bulb. Don't rake your leaves in the fall. This is a common mistake that people make. As we've already discussed, many creatures overwinter in that leaf litter. Butterflies, caterpillars, bees, you name it, they overwinter in the leaves. Not to mention that songbirds love to go through leaf litter looking for insects to eat, particularly during their fall migration. After we finish raking the leaves into a giant pile and jumping in them in our yard, we spread them into the garden. They are a wonderful mulch and provide the nutrients that a lot of native plants need. It's a win-win. The plants get fed, wildlife gets protected over winter, and leaf litter is a wonderful way to suppress weed growth. Not to mention that leaves are free. It just doesn't get any better than that. This beautiful morning cloak butterfly overwintered as an adult in our woodpile. We found it in the early spring as we shifted some wood around. They will also overwinter like many other insects in leaf litter. A great reason to leave the leaves. As we come to the end of the presentation, I wanted to provide you with some resources so that you can continue to learn more about native plant gardening and share your knowledge with your family, friends, and neighbors. In the creation of this presentation, I consulted several fantastic books. I would strongly recommend 3 titles by Dr. Doug Talmy: The Nature of Oaks, Nature's Best Hope, and Bringing Nature Home. Books by Heather Holm on bees and pollinators are a fantastic way to learn more about the relationships between pollinators and plants. They are also fabulous books for identifying native bees. I highly recommend you seek them out at your local library, or if I may insert a plug here for Wild Birds Unlimited, Barrie and Newmarket, we proudly carry Dr. Talmy's books as well as several other pollinator-themed titles. Aside from books, there are several other important resources you can turn to, including the Ontario Horticultural Association or similar associations outside of Ontario, as well as your local master gardeners groups. The Ontario Invasive Plant Council also has a fantastic and very informative website, ontarioinvasiveplants.ca. The North American Native Plant Society is a fantastic resource, with a great website, seed exchange, native plant sales, and a host of workshops. There are also a variety of online seminars you can join throughout North America from a wide variety of organizations. Land trusts and conservation authorities are great resources for gardeners and often offer plant sales and programs to help landowners restore habitat. Cities, towns, and regions have all kinds of events, programs, and partnerships aimed at planting trees and native plant gardens, along with conservation initiatives. Not-for-profits offer garden certification programs and information on how to attract wildlife. And lastly, there are some fantastic social media accounts and groups dedicated to native plant gardening. I have to plug Dr. Talmy's, of course, Homegrown National Park, but also the North American Native Plant Society has great social media pages, and another one I like is Mount Cuba Center. They are one of the largest native plant botanical gardens in North America. They feature very inspiring gardens on their social media and are on my bucket list to visit. Birdgardens.ca is a new website created by Birds Canada and proudly sponsored by Wild Birds Unlimited. This website is a fantastic resource, especially if you are new to native plant gardening. You simply select where you live in Canada, and you'll be given a list of potential plants that are ideal for your garden and the birds. Since we are in the age of technology, I also wanted to pass along 5 apps that will change your wildlife gardening experience. 2 are for recording your observations to help you keep track of what you're seeing in your garden and beyond, and the other 3 are designed to help you identify wildlife. Let's start with the 2 that you can use for recording your observations. Both of these apps are free to join, but do require you to register with a username. After registering, you can begin logging your sightings. eBird is an app specifically designed to keep track of all your bird sightings. It monitors the species you've seen, and you can create a yard patch to more closely monitor the birds in your backyard. iNaturalist is for recording sightings of all living things, whether it be birds, mushrooms, plants, mammals, insects, or reptiles. The wonderful thing about iNaturalist is that you get to connect with fellow naturalists. So once you share your observations, other naturalists will confirm your sightings. Seek is an app by iNaturalist that helps you identify what you are seeing by taking photos with your phone. While it's not perfect, it can often narrow down the plants, animals, and other living things you're seeing, at least getting the species down to the correct family. Merlin, a bird identification app from the Lab of Ornithology at Cornell, helps you to identify birds by descriptions, photos, and sounds. Yes, you heard me correctly. You can record a bird call and Merlin will identify what bird it is. Perhaps my favorite identification app is good old Google Photos. Using the Google Lens feature on your photo, Google will search all of its images and provide you with a list of similar images to yours. It is very accurate, and I'm surprised how often it's correct. We've come a long way in this presentation since we spoke about this disturbing headline. These types of headlines can be overwhelming and can often make us feel helpless. Like, I'm only one person. How am I going to stop 1 million species from going extinct? What can I possibly do to fix this? The truth is, yes, you may be one person, but one person can do a heck of a lot. One person can plant a native plant garden at their home, cottage, business, on their balcony. One person can reduce their lawn. One person can refuse to use pesticides and fertilizers. One person can use motion-sensitive lights or yellow bulbs. One person can remove the invasive species from their yard. One person can plant keystone species. One person can educate the people around them. One person can report their sightings to iNaturalist and eBird. One person can do a lot. If we all contribute in these ways, the impact to our wildlife would be huge. I hope through this presentation I've demonstrated why native plant gardening is essential, and that you as one person and your yard matters so much. As an example of what one person/one family making a difference can do, we moved into our current home in the fall of 2018, and every year since, we worked to create and enhance the habitat our yard provides. Here's a brief summary of our process and what we found. In the time since we've moved in, we've planted over 180 species of native flowering plants, ferns, vines, grasses, and sedges. We've planted 40+ species of trees and shrubs, in addition to the approximately 25 species that were already existing on the property before we moved in. We have eradicated from our yard and are in the process of eradicating several invasive species, including dog strangling vine, buckthorn, forget-me-nots, goutweed, periwinkle, and garlic mustard. We are also in the process of restoring a portion of our property into a meadow. Thus far, we've recorded 107 species of birds on our property, 50 of which we've recorded breeding. We've also recorded 35 species of butterflies and moths, but I think that's just a drop in the hat, since we only just recently started to catalog all the butterfly and moth species that we've seen. We've also noticed 10 species of reptiles and amphibians, and 14 species of mammals. And we're just one family. I'm proud of what our family has accomplished in our yard, and I hope you're proud of your accomplishments as well. This is why I think we should all celebrate our garden successes. When you work hard to create wildlife habitat and can then certify your yard as wildlife friendly, you have earned some bragging rights. So far, we've certified our yard as wildlife friendly with Monarch Watch, the Xerces Society, the North American Butterfly Association, the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and the National Wildlife Federation. And let me tell you, we get so excited every time we get to add a new sign into our garden showing off our certifications. As we wrap things up, I want to conclude with some final key takeaways. We need to landscape for caterpillars and pollinators. 70% of your garden should be native plants. Your garden matters, and what you plant in your garden really matters. You as one person or one family can make a huge difference. Any size space will have impacts that will benefit wildlife. Embrace biodiversity and all of the chew marks it leaves on your plants. That is the sign of a healthy garden, which is contributing to the local ecosystem. What you don't want is a sterile garden that no wildlife wants to be in. If something is eating your plants, that's a good sign that your garden is contributing and creating habitat for wildlife. Thanks for watching this presentation. We hope you enjoyed it and will join us for future events both in-store and online, such as seminars and bird walks. We have 2 great locations in Ontario to serve you, in Barrie and in Newmarket. You can also shop with us online 24/7, and we ship anywhere in Canada. You can find all of the details on our website, along with great information about backyard birds and nature. Look us up at wbu.com/Barrie and wbu.com/Newmarket. We also have some great online communities on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us using the handle at WBU Barrie and at WBU Newmarket. We have a great Facebook group called Ontario Birds, where you can ask questions, post pictures of the birds in your yard, and get connected with other bird and nature lovers just like you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching this presentation. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that you'll join us for future events in-store and online, such as in-store and online seminars and bird walks. We have 2 great locations in Ontario to serve you, in Barrie and in Newmarket. You can also shop with us online 24/7, and we ship anywhere in Canada. You can find all the details on our website, along with great information about backyard birds and nature. Look us up at wbu.com/Barrie and wbu.com/Newmarket. We also have some great online communities on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can find us using the handles at WBU Barrie and at WBU Newmarket. We have a great Facebook group called Ontario Birds, where you can ask questions, post pictures of the birds in your yard, and get to connect with other bird and nature lovers just like you. You can also find me, Kristen, on Instagram using the handle at Kristen Martin. That's Kristen with an E and Martin with a Y. Here you can follow along on my native plant gardening, birding, and wildlife adventures. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.